I've been thinking a lot recently about whether coaching work can or should go deep. This has been top of mind because in the fall, I am starting a coaching certification program. So I'm actively working to take all that I've learned about transformational change through the science of memory reconsolidation and craft it into a training that is both ethically and practically aligned with the framework of coaching. That mission has forced me to ponder the question, should coaching go deep? That's the question I would like to explore with you today, so let's dive in. Okay, so if we're going to explore whether coaches should go deep, we have to first define what deep even means. So in my mind, there are two different kinds of deep, but both have to do with exploring what we might call the unconscious mind. In other words, when we are going deep, it means we are moving into a territory that we haven't yet mapped. We are making the unconscious conscious. We're becoming aware of something we weren't previously. Now, by using words like unconscious, I might have set this up to sound non-scientific, but in truth, the scientific finding is that actually most of the information processing happening in our brain is not conscious to us. It's called implicit. Given how researchers have questioned the existence of the unconscious mind for so many decades, I think it is really interesting to see the tables actually flip on that. In a strange sort of plot twist, neuroscientists are now saying, look, we have a pretty good grasp of the brain's non-conscious processes. What's actually a more puzzling question is how the brain makes something conscious, or even why we have a conscious mind at all. That's called the hard problem of consciousness. It isn't actually clear what specific evolutionary function conscious processing takes over that unconscious processing couldn't handle. But that's a whole other topic. For now, let's just sit down with the fact that most of our brain's information processing and meaning making happens without our awareness. But why are we so in the dark? Well, there are two overarching reasons, and it is important to consider each separately because they point to the two kinds of depth I was mentioning, and both have different implications when it comes to coaching and ethics. But first, let me start with something I often tell my students, which is when we are exploring inwardly, other than finding our inner resources or wise knowings, which are great, there are really two main things we're aiming to discover or make conscious. One is what the person suffered, the other is what they learned from that suffering. People are usually at least somewhat in the dark about both, but for different reasons. First, let's start with what people suffered. It turns out that most of us don't want to be aware of what we suffered. For so many of us, our brain learned that it is safest to not go there, probably because we have some kind of prediction encoded that we can't handle it or maybe others can't handle it. In any case, it turns out that the brain has all sorts of ways of hiding painful realities from us. Now, there isn't just one scientific explanation for how this works because there are so many different versions, from super obvious avoidance tactics like distracting ourselves or choosing not to think about something or avoiding situations that might trigger a memory. Those more cognitive or behavioral tactics might be our first line of defense, but if we end up anyway heading into awareness of a pain that our brain really thinks we can't handle, that's where our brain might kick in and cause us to dissociate. As an aside, there are many versions of dissociation, and I'm not going to go over all of those. You can look up Ruth Lanius's work and various brain imaging studies. But needless to say, our brain can play smoke and mirrors or sleight of hand and just keep things out of our field of view in all sorts of ways. We could actually have a whole conversation just on how shame can work as a defense to protect a child from seeing that what they are experiencing is not right or even abuse, because if they deserved it, then it no longer is abuse. See how the brain has interesting, sometimes desperate ways of hiding painful truth? By the way, I go over this point in my video, why is it so hard to love ourselves? But boy, the deeper understanding of shame as a defense from seeing what we suffered is so often missing in people's training on shame, so I like to mention it here and there. Okay, with all of that in mind, I hope it makes sense to describe this one side of going deep as simply slowly building the capacity to look reality more and more clearly in the eyes, to sort of excavate the truth of what we suffered. Now, really, that excavation often reveals some beautiful things as well. But why is looking at the pain in particular so important? Because doing so allows us to prove to ourselves that we can handle it, which we almost always really can now that we're adults. That proof itself is so important because it releases our mind from all its efforts to keep us numb or distracted or in shame or stuck in all the other defenses that make our lives so much less fulfilling. There's actually a lot more to say about why it's so healing to finally address old pain, but that is a topic I cover more fully in my video, Why Go Deep in Therapy? Whereas today, we're trying to explore whether we can go deep in coaching. All right, so can we? I would say the answer is a bit nuanced, but it certainly isn't a resounding yes. Because the truth is, for people with severe trauma, going deep in terms of looking at what they suffered can be re-traumatizing. So for sure, if a person has a lot of unresolved trauma, in other words, they're still vulnerable to emotional overwhelm or destabilization, then they probably should not be working with a coach. Or if they are working with a coach for something more focused, like professional development, and then accidentally tip into an area where they suddenly start getting destabilized, that would be a moment for the coach to refer them out. That is certainly a line held by traditional coaching organizations like the ICF, and it's one I agree with and will teach in my coaching certification program I'm launching. That being said, is it a completely satisfactory, obvious line for me? Not completely, but only because I know most therapists also aren't trained in how to do skillful, safe deep work, because it isn't something we generally learn in graduate school. And for me, it's really more about the level of skill that matters versus the degree. That being said, if we keep to a simple frame here, most coaches should avoid deeper levels of exploration with people who don't have easy access to internal resources and might become overwhelmed or re-traumatized. But does that mean coaches shouldn't talk about old pain? No, because there are a lot of clients who are more than capable of looking at painful realities or painful memories. Look, it would be ridiculous to say you need a graduate degree in order to bear witness to someone's suffering or life story. Talking about painful things is one of the most important things we humans can do together. Imagine if my neighbor came over and told me her husband was diagnosed with cancer and started to cry. I wouldn't say, "I'm sorry, if you're going to get upset, I need to refer you to a professional." That would be so pathologizing of a healthy human thing, grieving or sharing our pain or connecting around hard truths. So even when it comes to this one version of going deep that has to do with addressing pain or painful memories, I do think coaches can potentially find their way safely into some depth, assuming that they themselves have the emotional capacity, have had good training, and are working with a client who has solid inner resources. But there's another kind of depth that we haven't yet explored. And that has to do with the other version of what we mean by unconscious mind. And that brings us back to the predictive processing model of the brain and the current understanding that our brain does most information processing non-consciously. I won't go into detail as to that model right now since I cover it in so many other videos. But just to summarize it briefly, I'll just say that when we're stuck in a pattern, which is most often why people seek out coaching help, it is usually because there is a learned prediction, you could say an unconscious belief, that predicts that we must stay in that pattern for some reason. So even if we consciously hate that we procrastinate or fail to set boundaries, if the brain is stuck in some kind of response, it is because we unconsciously think it is the best one. Okay, so if the first area of the unconscious mind has more to do with repression or avoidance of things actually meant to be conscious, this area of the unconscious mind is designed for knowings that are meant to be unconscious. Again, our implicit calculations about how reality works and how we should respond to it are by their nature designed to work without the need of conscious awareness. For whatever reason, our brain can only be conscious of a very small amount, so the brain really needs to offload most of its information processing to what is called implicit memory. Information held implicitly can be a bit hard to make conscious, but not for the same reasons outlined earlier related to fear of overwhelm. Again, implicit memory is non-conscious because the brain just doesn't think there's any practical reason for us to be aware of what it knows. It contains rules it learned really well, so why run them by the conscious mind if that's not necessary? With all that in mind, let me briefly describe what often happens when we try to ask ourselves why we keep doing something, or why something seems scary or so desirable, or whatever curious reaction we are having. But here's the thing. When we ask ourselves, why did I just do that? Or why do I feel tense right now? Our brain doesn't want to not know. It hates that. But it also doesn't want to waste energy finding a full, complete answer, because it would take a lot of coordination from many neural networks and require some work. So it will try to give a lazy answer because it thinks that's all we need. Researchers call that phenomenon confabulation. This is where experiential work comes in. In my mind, experiential techniques are about communicating to the deeper mind, hey, we actually want to know what you were predicting about this. This requires a lot of creativity and skill, and perhaps above else, curiosity. This is why I believe entering the domain of predictive processing is the perfect next step for the coaching world. In some ways, it isn't too far from what coaches do already. They help people slow down and really listen inside, not just for what they value and want, which is one thing coaches do, but also for the kinds of just under the surface narratives or assumptions or stories that are blocking the person from going for what they want, or from more fluidly finding their way around a problem. In other words, they help people get sort of mentally unstuck. What excites me is that if we add some experiential techniques here, drawing on models like coherence therapy, but also parts work or mind-body dialogue, then we can deepen the inner exploration to find out what our brain is really thinking. Not just in a scratch-the-surface way, but in a way that gets all the way to the root of the issue. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but if you get down to the root of the issue, you'll find a predictive model that was probably imprinted during a moment of pain, if not trauma, and that's one way to bump into the other kind of deep, unconscious material we were discussing before. And you'd be right, which is why I will be training my coaches to 1, develop some sturdiness and skill in receiving and witnessing painful material, 2, to know what cues to watch for that would alert them for when the client is going somewhere deeper than their system can easily go, maybe into trauma material they haven't processed in some other context, and 3, how to gently backtrack, stabilize, and refer out if necessary. Or if the client actually can handle linking the learning back to a moment of pain, then how to use that insight, and maybe even its emotional impact in the service of the goal of memory reconsolidation. Not to say that we always need to process pain in order to activate memory reconsolidation. In fact, about half the time we make an implicit prediction fully conscious, and we really nailed it with specificity, the brain's natural mismatch detection system will automatically flag it as being incorrect and begin updating it. By the way, I focus more on discovering what difficult learnings or truth are at play under the surface, but when we go deep, the other thing we discover are beautiful truths. It turns out when our brain is caught up in trying to avoid or cover over, it ends up also covering over a lot of beauty, particularly our own beauty. So when we go inside, that's also a chance to find our deeper, true resources and strength. When we sort of excavate our depth, it is by no means only so we can meet the hard things that need addressing, it is also so that we can meet ourselves. Look, obviously I'm a fan of depth, but I do know that some struggles do need to be treated medically. That being said, not every issue that might require some deep work in order to shift is necessarily a medical issue. Sometimes, but not always. Deep work and deep growth are broader than any one field or context. I love that we can find depth in so many places, in art and spirituality, in philosophy and relationships. There are so many emotional, truth-revealing experiences we can have. And should coaching potentially be one of them? Of course. If you'd like to know more about my coaching training program, I'll put more information below, including a video of testimonials from my previous students. I know this training will be a chance to meet more of my people, and I'm always thrilled for that opportunity. So welcome to CORE.
Welcome, friend, come inside.
Thank you so much for watching. I love making these YouTube videos, but I also love meeting you guys and diving even deeper together. So if you're liking my material, please consider signing up for one of my trainings. They can be found on my website, toriolds.com.